The August 23rd, 2018 meeting of the Woodbridge Township Board of Education will please come to order. Roll call, Mr. Secretary.
Ms. Anderson?
Here.
Ms. Bourdain?
Here.
Mr. Delapietro?
Here.
Mr. Harris?
Here.
Mr. Molnar?
Here.
Mr. Sedana?
Here.
Mr. Tamburello?
Here.
Mr. Velez?
Here.
Mr. Treebwasser?
Here. Mr. Secretary, as required by the Sunshine Law, please read the notice of meetings.
Thank you, Mr. President. The New Jersey Open Public Meetings Law was enacted to ensure the right of the public to have advance notice of and to attend the meetings of public bodies at which any business affecting their interest is discussed or acted upon. In accordance with the provisions of this Act, the Board of Education has caused notice of this meeting to be published by having the date, time, and place thereof posted as follows. January 10th, 2018 and August 3rd, 2018. Emailed to the Home News Tribune, the Star Ledger, and the Municipal Clerk's Office, posted in Avenel Middle School and the Board of Education Administration Building.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Delapietro, please read the closed session statement.
Thank you, Mr. President. In compliance with the Sunshine Law, the board must go into closed session in order to discuss subjects exempted from the public portion of our meeting. The discussions to be held in closed session will be regarding personnel matters. Any information regarding the closed session discussion will be released to the public when the reasons for discussing these matters in closed session no longer exist.
I have a motion by Mr. Delapietro. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Molnar. Do I have all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Carried. We'll adjourn as soon as we're done. Please rise for a salute to the flag and a moment of silence. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Do I have a motion to reconvene?
So motion?
I have a motion by Ms. Anderson, second.
Second.
Second by Mr. Sedana. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Roll call, Mr. Secretary.
Ms. Anderson?
Here.
Ms. Bourdain?
Here.
Mr. Delapietro?
Here.
Mr. Harris?
Here.
Mr. Molnar?
Here.
Mr. Sedana?
Here.
Mr. Tamburello?
Here.
Mr. Velez?
Here.
Mr. Treebwasser?
Here. Will someone make a motion to approve the minutes of the previous meetings?
So motion.
I have a motion by Mr. Tamburello. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Harris. Are there any additions or corrections? All in favor?
Aye.
Carried. Mr. Secretary, please state for the record any notice of bids received by the board.
Thank you, Mr. President. On August 8th, 2018, PD 19-15, lease purchase financing.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Mr. Secretary, please state for the record any communications or reports received by the board.
Mr. President, there were none at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Dr. Zaga, Superintendent's agenda, please.
Mr. President, I have 17 items to present to the board.
Do I have a motion for the superintendent's agenda?
So motion.
So motion by Mr. Delapietro. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Molnar. Any comments or questions from the board? Any comments or questions from the public? Roll call, Mr. Secretary.
Ms. Anderson?
On item number 10, I'm going to abstain on JFK Rehab Institute, yes on all other items.
Thank you. Ms. Bourdain?
Item number 2, I will abstain in the name of Susan Bourdain, yes on all other items.
Mr. Delapietro?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Molnar?
Yes.
Mr. Sedana?
Yes.
Mr. Tamburello?
Yes.
Mr. Velez?
Yes.
And Mr. Treebwasser?
Yes. Policy and Planning agenda, Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Mr. President. Policy and Planning Committee, on recommendation of the Superintendent of Schools, moves the following 6 items. I move the adoption of the foregoing.
I have a motion by Mr. Harris. Do I have a second?
Second?
Second by Ms. Anderson. Any comments or questions from the board? Any comments or questions from the public? Please state your name and the area of the town that you're from, please.
David Pinkowitz, Island. I'm sure there's no surprise here that I'm back to talk about the proposed policy for random drug and alcohol testing, which I've opposed for basically since I've known about it. You know, I'm not going to fully repeat myself. The board knows the facts that there really is no evidence that these type of programs work. Just want to mention a few more things. I think for policy reasons, this policy is flawed. I think for state requirements of what a policy must contain, I think it's flawed. For example, we go in describing the testing process, and it talks about, and I think it's paragraph L, that it talks about the swab testing. And then it says if a student violates or fails that, they will have formal testing. Formal testing, of course, is not described in the policy at all. It says it will be in accordance with the state regulations. State regulations require that the acquisition and handling of student specimens be listed in the policy, and I don't believe it is. The board's made reference to urine testing. The policy references a bathroom, but nowhere in the policy does it reference how to take the policy. If the board chooses to take final action today, I will do whatever I need to do to try to stop this policy. But that's up to the board. I think the board needs to look at it, amend it, and then have a hearing when the school year is in progress, not like here where it's just put, the legal notice was made for this meeting, but obviously there was no announcement made or anything. The parents are literally back in a few weeks, and I think there's no reason that we shouldn't wait till all the parents come back to be informed about this potential policy, something that was never really done during the school year. But separate from that, I find it a little ironic that in the last meeting we learned about the board settlement of a complaint against the Office of School Ethics. And one of the issues about this policy, the biggest issue, of course, is the privacy concerns, the privacy of the students. It's balancing the privacy interests of the student versus the purported drug problem, and whether or not this is a good policy for that problem, and whether or not the privacy interests of the students should be overcome based on balancing tests that the courts have come up with to have this policy. And the board is basically given no credence. Not one board member has commented about the privacy rights of the students. Not one board member has expressed even a little bit of regret that it's necessary to take away their rights in order to have this policy. Yet, we find out in the last meeting that the board did not want the names of their relatives, the reasons why they couldn't vote except for a doctrine of necessity being adopted by the board on a vote where there were a number of board members, a majority of board members with a conflict, and the board actually sued, spent over $20,000 of taxpayer money to fight the School Ethics Commission, simply because they did not want to say the names of the board members' relatives that the conflict was with. And I find it ironic that the board can care so much about their own privacy for relatives that are listed in publicly available documents, documents that have to be filed each and every year. Not to mention they're all public employees. Anyone could find out who the list of teachers, secretaries, et cetera are. And I find it ironic that the board doesn't care about the students, but cares greatly about spending lots of taxpayer money to fight for their rights. And I'll talk more about that in detail later during public comment, but I just think that if the board cares about privacy rights at all, and apparently it does, at least for its own, then they should not vote for this policy. They should vote no. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pinkowitz.
Mr. President? I'll let the next constituent come forth first.
Hi, Dan Grossberg from Midland. Question on the policy itself, specifically the eligibility for testing. It says in line C that students must submit the consent to test form on or before the first day they participate in practice. Have there been any sports or athletics that have already commenced for this coming school year?
Yes.
So if this were to go in place, what would happen with those students who have not submitted the form?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So, I mean, in order to be eligible for the testing, they have to consent to this. They have to submit their form on or before the first practice. If practice has already begun, does that mean that they're exempt from testing because they're not eligible?
The policy, once it's put into effect, then we would, in essence, have those students be part of the program. So if we enact it tonight, then the next eligible season may be the time when it gets implemented.
Next eligible season, you said. So next school year, it seems like?
No, the next season could be the fall season. or the spring, or the winter season. Wrestling, basketball, because those teams haven't started practicing yet.
Okay, but the ones who are currently engaged and already practicing, they would be ineligible until the next season to be in this test.
They would be ineligible, I believe, based on the policy for this particular season, but if they were to participate in another sport, then they would be eligible.
Got it. All right, thank you.
Yes, Mr. Harris.
That was an excellent point by Mr. Roseberg. Thank you for bringing that up. Obviously, the fall sports season has started. However, of course, parking permits as well as the club participation signups have not yet happened. So they would be covered under that as well as the winter season. And I appreciate the administrator's clarity before the public this evening. A little frustrated with Mr. Pinkowitz's comments earlier. The suggestion that we don't care about the students or we don't care about the students' privacy. Dr. Zega, through the chair, could you speak to, are students' names revealed in any way, shape, or form throughout the process?
Mr. Harris, no, it's complete privacy. It's, as we've stated, it does not become part of the student's discipline record. The records are not shared with the police.
Sure.
And I think the reason why this took so long is because the regulations were written specifically for urine testing, to be less intrusive and to be more basically convenient for the students. We're using swab tests, not urine tests.
Sure.
And this would help with making sure that all the tests were confidential. We don't need a bathroom to conduct the test. There's they don't have to worry about the chain of custody for the urine samples and send them to a lab. This takes a couple seconds to swab the cheek and get the results.
Sure.
It's convenient for the students. It's convenient for the administration. It's less intrusive.
Sure. And Dr. Zega, and just for clarification, the purpose of this program is for the safety of students. It's to identify students who perhaps have begun experimenting or perhaps are already addicted to any kind of illicit drug. The purpose is to identify those students for the sake of themselves and their parents or guardians to get them the help that they need, correct?
That's correct, Mr.
Okay.
Harris. There's a mandatory counseling requirement, and there's no academic penalty.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Zega.
Mr.
Hi,
President?
excuse me.
I'm sorry, Mr.
Megan
President?
Brown, can I speak, or?
Yes,
But I
ma'am.
just wanted to say one thing,
Okay.
kind of on the grounds that Mr. Harris started. Under testing procedure, letter D, it says the students eligible for the testing will be identified by their designated identification number, not their name, in order to maintain confidentiality. You know, I think what the board had fought for with the personnel agenda was that the names are out there, announced, and I'll tell you the God's honest truth, on being chair of personnel, I really don't want anybody's name in the personnel agenda, because why should everybody have to see so-and-so, what they make? You talk about an invasion of privacy. I mean, I do know you're getting public money, but you know what? Put their employee number. And then, you know, so with this one, it's not the name of the student being used according to the policy, it's the student's identity number. So.
Hi, Megan Brown, Colonia. I have a question about the cost. How much per test? Do you have that figure?
It's around $10, between $10 and $11.
$10 per test?
a unit,
And
yes,
then
ma'am.
how many, like, do you know, because it's supposed to be random.
We have a
Is there-
minimum, we're gonna do a minimum of 10%. And we figure that's gonna be somewhere, you know, in the ballpark of 100 students at school. About 100 students at school.
100 students at school, so 10, and how
So
many
it's about
schools?
between $3,000 and $4,000 for the swab tests.
For the random
Yes.
drug
And
testing?
depending on how many students were to test positive, that cost would go up depending on how many kids had to go for further testing.
Right, and before that, it was a suspected drug use or
Yes.
alcohol use, and then you would do a drug test?
Yes,
Was
ma'am.
that not effective? Like, what's
It's not that
the-
it's not effective, but that's basically taking care of it after it's already happened. This is more along the lines to give the kids a tool to be
But
able
they've
to.
already done the drugs, right?
Correct. And this is to give the
Either
kids.
way, so they're
Well,
testing
no,
positive.
honestly, what it is this
right?
way, at least our hope is, and as I've told Mr. Pinkowitz on several occasions, that this is not etched in stone, this is not something forever, and once, if it is enacted, is on the books forever and will never be reviewed again. This is something that we're looking at as a tool to help students.
Review it next year?
I would like to think as a
mean,
board, we're going to review it in
Yeah,
a
like
couple of months
compare
to see,
how,
to see what it's doing, to see if it's helping, to talk to our SAC coordinators, to find out if they're getting positive feedback and results that are showing that it is giving the kids what we want is the intent, is to give them a tool when in a situation of possible peer pressure, they can say, look, I don't want to take that chance because I like doing the math club and I don't want to miss my competition, or I don't want to miss doing the school play, or I don't want to miss my parking permit. Just another way for them to say, hey, listen, you know what, I'll pass, thank you very much.
What
This
about
is not
the-
to invade their privacy,
Right.
this is not to hinder them in any way, this is only to try and help, because quite honestly, as much as Mr. Pinkowitz likes to think that drugs are not truly an issue and they're not escalating in our country, I beg to differ. And I think that any tool that we can give the students to be able to say no is along the lines of Nancy Reagan's just say no thing, but it's a different time, different tools.
right, and that was largely ineffective, the DARE program and the Just Say No. I mean, that's why we don't do it anymore, because it was largely ineffective.
So the
So-
option, you have two choices then. You keep trying something different or you just give up.
Right,
We choose not to give up.
I totally agree. I don't think we should give up, but I think that other school districts in other parts of the country have done this, and they've seen no proven effects one way or the other. So
It's kind of hard to quantify prevention.
well, how are you going to quantify it? Because how are you if you review it next year? Like,
I'm glad you asked that, because currently what happens is the SACs get a lot of information through the students. They meet with them a lot, and they get a lot of feedback from them. And that's going to be one of the big pillars of this whole program, is the information that we get back from our SACs, to make sure that they're getting positive information and to see what we're getting. I mean, if we're testing, let's say hypothetically, 10 students, and we're getting 9 positives, it's not really being effective. But if we're testing 10 students and we're getting 0, it may be being effective and may be worth continuing.
what about the other students, the non-athletic,
All parents have the-
non-club,
All parents have the
non-driving?
right to opt their student in.
No, I mean, if the other students aren't required to submit to anything like this.
Right, as a
Right,
parent, you would have
so-
the right to opt your child into the
No,
program.
I know that. I'm saying the kids that don't do a sport or don't do a club or don't drive to school are just, what's their, where do they fit?
Well, they could certainly say, I mean, I don't think that when they're at a party, that everybody knows what the child does in their spare time. They can certainly say, look, I don't want to get pulled for random drug testing. It's only a tool. It is not the end-all answer.
Okay, I would like to see if something, maybe an amendment to the policy that it will be reviewed. Is that already in there? I haven't actually, I've read it, but I didn't see anything in there about that. Like an
We are
amendment that
going
it
to
will be,
We are going to review it, but I believe by law, and I'm not a lawyer by any stretch.
Oh, no, nor am I.
I don't believe we can test everybody, and that's why we
no,
chose
and that's
chose the
not
group
what
that
I'm
we
sorry.
did.
That's not what I meant. I meant,
So hopefully the SACs will be able to come back to us and say, listen, we're seeing that the group that is not involved and is not participating in anything, they need something that they can utilize. Here's our suggestion. Because they're our experts.
right, and then what about, like, the school board meeting at this time next year? Will there be a review comparing whatever the statistics we had before to the statistics that we have from this year?
Yes.
Is there something in the policy that there will be a review?
My intent would not be to wait until next year, but would be to look at it throughout this year.
Okay,
And see
so
how it's
like
doing.
fall and then fall, or winter sports and
I
then
don't know,
spring
maybe-
sports
maybe
or
in
whatever?
November, December, look at it, and then look at it again in March, and then look at it again in June.
Okay, yeah, all right, thank you.
Through the chair, Ms. Brown, I just wanted to address, I think you were getting at the students who don't, it's about 25%, we anticipate approximately could be as high as 25% of students who don't participate in the sport or club,
Right,
parking, or
or
their
park,
parents
right.
choose to opt them in. Those students would still be subject to the suspected drug policy that we
Oh,
have
that's still in
today.
effect for the rest of
Yes.
Correct.
the student body?
Correct, which today has a more,
Punitive.
yeah, well, how would you call it?
Punitive.
Punitive, yes, punitive punishment, where there's 4 days out of school suspension if confirmed to be under
Yeah,
the
I saw in the
influence.
policy that they're not suspended, but they do have to pay for their own drug or alcohol counseling. The new policy, right?
Correct. We would do the referral. However, I think their private insurance would pick up the
Well,
cost
if they
of
have,
any
yeah,
kind of.
but they are not suspended from school.
Correct. They are not suspended, and we have a kind of a restorative justice approach of, not only informing the parents. There's no suspension from school. There's a brief suspension from the club, the activity, the sport, or the
Until
parking
they
privilege.
test,
And then again,
right.
there's the sessions with the SAC counselor to kind of talk it out. So we think it's a better, more responsible approach to
I agree. The suspension is usually
deterring drug
yeah.
use.
Is there talk about amending the other policy to no suspension, to in-school suspension?
I think it's required by law, if I'm not mistaken.
I don't understand. Can you repeat the question?
In the new policy, or the old policy, is still in effect for the rest of the student body. Is there talk of amending that so there's an in-school suspension instead of out-of-school suspension for that?
I would have to look at the policy to see
Yeah, I don't
what
know
the
either.
discipline is, but traditionally, if a student is found to be under the influence, they have to go to the doctor has to clear them to return, and depending on the circumstances, there may be additional, that's for health reasons, to make sure they're able to come back to school. But there may be discipline imposed, was it in school?
Right.
Were there other students involved? That would be a disciplinary matter.
The new policy, they have to test negative also in order to return to school, or?
A doctor has to clear them
Right, yeah.
to return to school.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Roll call, Mr. Wolfman?
Ms. Anderson?
Yes.
Ms. Bourdain?
I apologize. I'll be. Yes.
Mr. Delapietro?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Molnar,
Yes.
Mr. Sedana?
Yes.
Mr. Tamburello?
Yes.
Mr. Velez?
Yes.
Mr. Treebwasser?
Yes. Curriculum agenda, Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Curriculum Committee, on recommendation of the Superintendent of Schools and Assistant Superintendent for Curriculum Instruction, present the following 30 items. I move the adoption of the foregoing.
I have a motion by Mr. Harris. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Sedana. This evening, we have a presentation from Mr. Bader regarding AP test scores. Mr. Bader, if you'd be so kind.
Yes, Mr. President. This is a presentation of Woodbridge Township School District 2018 Advanced Placement Analysis and Benefit. AP status for 2018, 25 AP courses were offered in the 3 high schools during the 2017-18 school year. 1,374 AP tests were taken by 710 different students in May 2018. We participate in the All In campaign, which increases equity and access by evaluating student potential for participation in AP and district potential for expanding AP offerings with a focus on including underrepresented students. AP test results for 2018. Colleges usually grant credit for AP scores of a 3, 4, or 5. 813 out of the 1,374 tests taken in 2018 will likely result in a student receiving college credit in the appropriate course. AP test results comparison show the greatest number of total tests taken last school year. And even though we increased the number of tests taken, our scores remained high. In fact, in an analysis of the last 3 school years, our average score has increased to 3.0. Again, I would like to congratulate the high schools, thank the high school administrators, the principals, vice principals, department heads, the counseling department for encouraging the students to take chances and take on rigorous challenges in school. I'd really like to thank the teachers who teach these courses. For them, it's really a passion that they show and demonstrate, and that's why the students are willing to take on this advanced coursework. Most of all, I'd like to thank the students for taking the most rigor and actually getting the best of preparation for college and careers in the future. And I look forward to continued success in our AP programs.
Thank you, Mr. Bader. Are there any comments or questions from the board?
Mr. President?
Mr. Harris?
Just one item. I just want to recognize number 9 and to thank the administration for this. The administration will be putting on 12 assemblies at our middle and high schools, as well as one parent forum. It's called Public and Permanent. It's an assembly to educate parents and students about the dangers, if you will, of what you say and do and post online, with the district expanding our one-to-one initiative from all 8th graders last year to all 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th, and 12th graders. It is important that we provide them with the knowledge and the tools that what they say, do, and post online is public and permanent, and it could have an effect on future employment, college acceptance, and among other things, as well as military, of course. So I want to thank the administration for prioritizing internet safety and security. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Harris.
Mr.
Anyone?
President?
Yes, sir, Mr. Molnar.
Just going over the numbers, thank you to Mr. Bader. You know, the AP classes are a great tool. They really do prepare a student for who is going to move on to college to take on the rigors of a course study. But I know I commented in the past, I mean, I think colleges now are kind of getting wise to the AP thing, and now I know they're making it kind of harder for parents to, you know, get the full impact of the financial value of it. But just looking at our numbers, I was always worried about, are we watering down our AP classes, where maybe some students who don't belong taking an AP class are taking it, and then the teacher has to slow down the acceleration of the study so that the students who are kind of behind don't get totally left behind. But kind of looking at the last set of numbers, it looks like the amount of students who took the AP classes went down, but the amount of students who took the test went up, and actually the average score went up. So, you know, it's, even though less kids were taking the class, maybe the ones who belong to be taking the class are taking it, because not everybody is college bound. So I just don't want this program to get to the point where we're just going to have a trophy that we have so many kids enrolled in the AP. We have to make sure that it's effective and the AP stays the way the AP was intended. The vigor of the study, that we're not going to water it down just by saying that we have so many kids involved in it. So thank you again to Mr. Bader and the administration.
Thank you, Mr. Molnar. Any comments or questions from the public?
David Pinkowitz, Island. Following up on the APs and having had a daughter that's taken several of the AP classes that are offered, I think while the scores may be good, I think there are ways to make them better. And what this district does, the AP classes were originally designed for traditional schedules, 7 or 8 periods a day, single periods for the full year. And they remain basically designed for that design. Then there's those districts that choose block scheduling. There's 2 kinds of blocks. There's AB blocks, where you have all your classes alternating in A days and B days. So you have them for the full year, similar to the traditional schedule, the only difference being that you double up the time you spend in each class on each day and have only half the classes each day. We have a 4x4 block schedule, at least at Kennedy. I think the other schools, I know there was some kind of, I've heard talk about experimentation at Colonia, but I'm not sure what the status is of that. But I'll speak at least to Kennedy. 4x4, of course, there's 4 classes in the fall semester, 4 classes in the spring semester, which creates 2 kind of different problems for our AP students. For AP classes that take place in the fall semester, they get a benefit that most students in the rest of the country don't get, which is they get to finish their entire AP class for a full semester before the test is even taken. The bad part about that is they finish that semester in February. So even if though they might have some catch-up sessions, take some extra refresher classes, on the way, they're really finishing their AP class long before they actually take the AP exam, which are always held in May. The spring semester is a different problem. New Jersey already is at a detriment, New Jersey schools in general, because New Jersey finishes typically mid to late June, depending on the district. Many districts around the country finish by the end of May or early June. So when they take their AP exams, they may be 2 or 3 weeks away from the end of school, maybe even, depending on what that particular district does. New Jersey typically has more than a month remaining of class time before the end. When I say more than a month of class time, though, that's talking in terms of a traditional schedule or in terms of an AB block schedule, which have a pretty much equivalent class time, just done different ways. You have a certain amount of time left that you can't teach for the test anymore. You could teach content, certainly, but it's not going to help the kids on the exam. On the other hand, we have a 4x4. We have twice as much class time in the class for classes that take place in the spring after the exam takes place. And obviously, in that situation, that either creates, what it mostly creates, I think, is teachers try to rush, which probably doesn't teach the class as ideally in the spring as it does in the fall. Or they just simply are behind, and the kids have to, on their own time, figure out a way to find out the rest of the curriculum that they missed. So I think the district really seriously needs to think about whether either get rid of block scheduling, go back to traditional, or if keeping block scheduling, follow what most of the districts that use block scheduling do and have AB blocks. I think the way we do it now creates, like I said, problems that could cause the AP scores, in particular the APs because of the exam that takes place in May, to not be as successful, at least on the exam time. And cause, like I said, in the spring, a very bad situation where people are rushing and they don't treat, the class doesn't get taught as properly as it would be if it were spread out over a traditional time period. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Pinkowitz.
Through the chair?
Yes, Mr.
Sorry,
Harris.
I know I'm the Gabby one tonight. I want to thank Mr. Pinkowitz for his comments. He's spot on, correct. I've talked about this with the administration time and again. We've been piloting 8 periods at Ford's Middle School for I think 3 or 4 years now, and I want to applaud Mr. Pace and his administration for testing out a new model. Mr. Pinkowitz is dead on right that students who take spring block semester classes at our high school levels are shortchanged when taking their May AP class, and I would urge the administration to take Mr. Pinkowitz at his recommendation, and I'm sure the recommendation of others. An hour and 20 minutes in a classroom is just crazy in my opinion. 40 minutes or 60 minutes, in my opinion, is far more appropriate. So I hope Mr. Pace's experiment this year at Colonial High School is a success, and we consider either his model or the model at Ford's Middle School going forward. So just want to throw out that.
Thank you, Mr. Harris.
Thank you.
Any other comments or questions? Roll call?
Ms. Anderson?
Yes.
Ms. Bourdain?
Yes.
Mr. Delapietro?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Molnar?
Yes.
Mr. Sedana?
Yes.
Mr. Tamburello? Yes. Mr. Velez?
Yes.
Mr. Treebwasser?
Yes. Finance and Insurance, Mr. Tamburello.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Finance and Insurance Committee, on recommendation of the Superintendent of Schools and the Business Administrator Board Secretary, presents the following 12 items. This evening, I move for the adoption of the foregoing 12 items.
I have a motion by Mr. Tamburello. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Ms. Anderson. Are there any comments or questions from the board?
Through
Mr.
the
President?
board.
Yes, sir, Mr. Molnar.
In item number 12, there's a few elementaries that aren't listed. Were these requested by the elementaries that are listed, or were they assigned this amount, or was an audit done? You want to answer it for him? Sure.
Mr. Molnar, the school that's omitted is Ross Street, number 11, and that obviously we're not going to do any extensive wiring there because we won't be in operation.
No, I knew that. It looks like Ross Street's not in there, and that's because it's obvious, and 29 is obvious because all the work that was done, but and 28's not in there. I don't know,
I could check on 28, but I believe 28 was already finished.
oh, okay.
Mr. Tamburello, I believe you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. President. A couple things this evening on the Finance and Insurance agenda. Last month, I'm sure the community was aware that very close to our meeting, our July meeting, we received some very positive news out of Trenton about the extraordinary aid to this district, and we were confident at that point that it was going to be certainly beneficial to the taxpayers of this township. After a month of review and some other committee meetings that we've had on the topic, we're ready to present, I think, a presentation this evening on what the impact of that positive news is to our district, our taxpayers, our students, our staff. I think it's significant. A little background first, when we did receive the extraordinary aid amount, being that it was discussed in our finance committee, it took about less than a minute to decide the proper balance. I think that it was a great compromise, great solution on how to utilize the extra funds out of Trenton. Certainly putting it toward tax relief was big on the committee's mind. Putting it away for a rainy day was also big, and capital improvements, and certainly dedicating a portion of it for next year and some capital improvements that may be on the horizon. I think it was a very responsible way to address the extra funds. I'm happy to present it this evening. And with that, Dr. Zega, you can go on with the presentation. And Mr. President, I have another comment afterwards.
Yes, sir, Mr. Tamburello.
Mr. President, Mr. Tamburello, this is the budget presentation that was presented last spring. This is slide 15 of that presentation. Due to the $3.5 million in extra state aid we received, 1/3 of that, approximately 1.16, went to tax relief for this current year. So our, based on $75,000 assessed valuation for 2018-19, it was $4,248. It is now $4,221. So the difference is not $86, but $59 would be the increase. And our historical data, based on the past, going back to 2001, 2002, you see our trend is, we had a slight uptick this year, but not as much of an uptick as we originally thought. So the taxes are, on average, have been going down since 2010. We're very happy that, as Mr. Timberell said, to apply some of our state aid, our extra state aid this year to tax relief.
Thank you, Dr. Zega. Mr. Tamburello, you said you had another comment to make?
On a different line item, so if anybody else has.
I'll jump in on the tax impact to the voter. If you ever been on the Woodbridge Township website, you can look up tax information and you can look at your tax bill. If you haven't already noticed, for August 1st and the November 1st tax bill, if you will, you will see an actual reduction of your taxes. I don't know how often that's happened in our recent history, but it certainly is worthy of noting. This is not just a PowerPoint presentation, just fancy numbers on a page. It is an actual reduction of your tax assessment, not tax assessment, your tax bill. So please take a look at that if you haven't already seen it.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. Are there any other comments or questions from the board?
Yes, through the board president.
Yes, sir, Mr. Tamburello.
Item number 8, I'd also like to, for lack of a better word, give a shout out to our administration, certainly our back office with Mr. Wolferman, and purchasing on number 8, going out for the Chromebooks as we roll out our one-to-one, another significant initiative that this board undertook. That item is a savings by going out for this funding and getting the rate that we did. What we thought was a certain amount budgeted I believe, Mr. Wolferman, you can chime in, or Dr. Zaga, about a $45,000 savings as far from what I figured out in our committee meetings. But Dr. Zaga, Mr. Wolferman, if you can elaborate on the one-to-one and the Chromebook lease?
Sure. The original lease that was offered by the company who was selling us the Chromebooks, their total interest rate over 4 years was $98,391. By going out and bidding this, we got that down to $53,754. So a significant savings for the district by doing that.
Thanks again for your work on that, you and your office. I appreciate it. I'm sure the community does as well. And with that, then finance is, I'm done, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. Tamburello. Are there any comments or questions from the public?
Dan Grossberg, Island.
Yes, sir.
This question, I'm more kind of curious, to the point that you just raised about item number 8, the purchasing of the Chromebooks. That seems to conflict, or at least I just don't understand, in number 11, where it seems to be resolved that the use of non-Apple products would require wholesale replacement, et cetera, that would utterly defeat the purpose of public contracting laws. So it seems like that it is a benefit to buy Apple-only products, but then we're also buying non-Apple products, not only here, but in a few agenda items later on with the contract awarded to pay for Dell. Do you mind expanding or helping me understand the difference there, or why we're able to do things like that?
Dr. Zaga?
Mr. President, the Chromebooks are in the high school. The iPads, Apple products are not only in the elementary schools, but there are other Apple products, including Apple TVs, that we bought district-wide, and that's what we use for our interface, for our projectors, and for our screens. But as far as we thought, and we're still going back and forth. You know, we don't want to be an Apple district, and we don't want to be a Dell district or a Chromebook district. We think it's important that students get exposed as much as possible to every kind of tool available, because we don't know what they'll be using when they leave.
So with that in mind, does it kind of defeat the purpose of having public contracting laws then, if we're going to expose to other kinds of technologies? I mean, as stated in number 11?
If I understand correctly, the Chromebooks were purchased through a co-op, as are the Apple products. So I'm not sure what your question is, but they're both legally can be purchased through co-ops or bidding process, which is why the finance, because it was not on the co-op, was bid out, because that wouldn't apply. But co-ops we are allowed to use because the co-op actually did bidding to get the best price. So that's
Sure.
how the co-ops work for the Hunterdon County Educational Services for the Apple products, and the original Chromebooks were done by a co-op purchase. That was on a previous agenda when they were purchased. So this is just the financing that we bid out to get that lower rate from the co-op price, which was the higher $98,000. By bidding it, we save money. So you can do bidding or co-op. We chose to save the most money by doing that, if I'm answering your question, hopefully.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just kind of curious why it's written in here then, like why we're pointing that out in
Any
this
purchase
agenda.
any purchase over our bid threshold would be on an agenda, whether we bid it out or it's through the co-op. That's why it's delineated. If we use the co-op, we put it on. Is that?
Did that answer your question? Because I don't think it did, because I'm not sure I understand your question.
Not really. So, I mean, we all have the agenda here, right? So if we look 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 paragraphs down from number 11, it explicitly states the use of non-Apple products, and I'll let you guys read the rest. I'm just kind of curious why that's written in there if we are going to use non-Apple products. Like, should we either remove that and allow us to get exposure to other technologies, or should we stick to just Apple products?
This is referring to just the Apple products were purchased using non-Apple products with their Apple products.
So I think, if I'm understanding you correctly, what this is referring to is when we purchase Apple products, that we have to only use Apple products with their product. I don't think it's referring to using Apple products or non-Apple products throughout the district.
Okay.
I mean, I think if I understand you correctly, that was your concern, is why is it saying that you can only, that if you use non-Apple products, then you can't.
It's kind of like, and I don't know if this is the right word, but it's something like the integrity of the board. Like, why are we explicitly stating this if we're not going to abide by it, sort of thing? That's all. Like, I don't care about the technology that we use. I think it's great that we have exposure to Android and Dell and Windows and all that stuff. I don't know. It's just like an accountability type thing, I guess.
May I do the board president? If we're looking for an Apple product, we're going to buy from Hunterdon. If we're looking for a textbook from McGraw-Hill, doesn't mean we can't go out and look at Orton-Gillingham. So if we're looking for Apple products, we'll abide by the Hunterdon County Co-op to get the best price that they've worked on. But when we're in the market for a Chromebook, we use the other co-op. So again, it's choice, it's flexibility, it's multiple devices. But if we want to use Apple, we think our best avenue to do that is through the Hunterdon County Co-op.
Okay.
When we want Apple products.
Got it. All right. Thank you.
Sir, does it make sense that, I think in most bids that we do, and the attorney will correct me if I'm wrong, because she always does, but if we want to buy something, we typically would put in, we want a Chevy or equivalent. But if we only wanted a specific type of equipment, then I think that's the reason for that type of language. If we want an Apple, we don't want what somebody deems as an equivalent, we want an iPad. And maybe, Samsung says that theirs is equivalent, and they would lay out and say, well, look, we can do this, this, and this that are very similar, but the operating systems are significantly different. And we as educators don't necessarily feel that the operating system in the Samsung is the same as the Apple. So I believe that's the purpose of putting that in there, so that we are, in essence, buying only Apple products when we are looking for Apple devices. We're not looking for an equivalent.
Gotcha. All right.
Does that
Yeah, that's closer.
help
Sure.
somewhat?
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you.
Does that sound right? Okay. Roll call, Mr. Secretary.
Ms. Anderson.
Yes.
Ms. Bourdain.
On item number 1, I will abstain in the name of Susan Bourdain, yes to all other items.
Mr. Delapetro. Yes. Mr. Harris.
Yes.
Mr. Molnar.
Yes.
Mr. Sedano.
Yes.
Mr. Tamburello.
Yes.
Mr. Velez.
Yes.
Mr. Treebwasser.
Yes. Security and safety agenda, Mr. Delapetro, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Safety and School Safety Committee, recommendation of the Superintendent of Schools presents the following 3 items. I move for the adoption of the foregoing.
Thank you, Mr. Delapetro. Do I have I have a motion by Mr. Delapetro. Do I have a second?
Second?
Second by Ms. Anderson. Any comments or questions from the board?
Mr. President,
Yes, Mr. Molnar.
through the chair, I know the last couple months, especially during school and security and school safety, we've been voting on a lot of agenda items for parochial schools, the non-publics. Now, I guess through the chair to Dr. Zager or Mr. Wolferman, where does the money come to fund these products?
Go ahead, Dr. Mr. Wolf.
Mr. Molnar, the way it works is the state provides money for the non-public schools based on enrollment. That money is then given to the Woodbridge School District, so it goes into our funds that we segregate for the non-publics individually, the different ones that we have throughout the district. And then as purchases are made, we follow the same purchasing laws of 18A that we would for any other purchase, and make purchases accordingly, and we ensure that we never overexpend the amount that has been given to us by the state for those schools.
Now, if we look at like item 1, 24 38 by 72 window shades, did we get this price?
The non-public school got the price. However, we ensure that items that are over the $6,000 quote threshold, or if it were to be the case, a $40,000 bid threshold, that is done properly, and we have the quotes or bid depending on this. Since this was below the quote threshold, we can take this price as it stands.
So this could have been just somebody in the school called up, got a price on a shade, and so we don't know what cost comparison went into getting the price for the shade?
Correct. The school the non-public school does it, but again, it's their funding, so we would hope that they would know to get the best price for that money that's being allocated to them.
So my question is, do they ever get to a point where if they're only allotted a certain amount of money, do we ever get to the point where we have to kick in our money to cover what?
Never, no. This money is strictly for the specific non-public schools. does not get commingled with the board's money. And again, if the amount were over the $6,000, then we would get involved to get quotes.
Okay, thank you.
Any other comments or questions from the board? Comments or questions from the public? Roll call, Mr. Secretary.
Ms. Anderson?
Yes.
Ms. Bourdain?
Yes.
Mr. Delapietro?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Molnar,
Yes.
Mr. Sedana?
Yes.
Mr. Tamburello?
Yes.
Mr. Velez?
Yes.
Mr. Treebwasser?
Yes. Technology, Mr. Sedana.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Technology Committee, on the recommendation of the Superintendent of Schools and the Assistant Superintendent for Curriculum and Instruction, presents the following 3 items. I move for the adoption of the foregoing.
I have a motion by Mr. Sedana. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Tamburello. Are there any comments or questions from the board? Any comments or questions from the public? Roll call, Mr. Secretary.
Ms. Anderson?
Yes.
Ms. Bourdain?
Yes.
Mr. Delapietro?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Molnar,
Yes.
Mr. Sedana?
Yes.
Mr. Tamburello?
Yes.
Mr. Velez?
Yes.
Mr. Treebwasser?
Yes. Buildings and Grounds, Mr. Molnar.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Buildings and Grounds Committee, on the recommendation of the Superintendent of Schools and the Business Administrator Board Secretary, presents the following. Tonight, I will be moving 1 item.
I have a motion by Mr. Molnar. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Delapietro. Any comments or questions from the board? Any comments or questions from the public? Roll call, Mr. Secretary.
Ms. Anderson?
Yes.
Ms. Bourdain?
Yes.
Mr. Delapietro?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Molnar,
Yes.
Mr. Sedana?
Yes.
Mr. Tamburello?
Yes.
Mr. Velez?
Yes.
Mr. Treebwasser?
Yes. Transportation Agenda, Mr. Velez.
Thank you, Mr. President. Transportation Committee, on the recommendation of the Superintendent of Schools and the Business Administrator Board Secretary, present the following 9 items. I move for the adoption of the foregoing.
I have a motion by Mr. Velez. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second.
Second by Ms. Anderson. Are there any comments or questions from the board? Any comments or questions from the public? Roll call, Mr. Secretary.
Ms. Anderson?
Yes.
Ms. Bourdain?
Yes.
Mr. Delapietro?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Molnar,
Yes.
Mr. Sedana?
Yes.
Mr. Tamburello?
Yes.
Mr. Velez?
Yes.
Mr. Treebwasser?
Yes. Personnel Agenda, Mr. Molnar.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Personnel Committee, on the recommendation of the Superintendent of Schools and the Assistant Superintendent of Human Resource, presents the following. Tonight, I'll be moving 24 items.
I have a motion by Mr. Molnar. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Harris. Are there any comments or questions from the board? Any comments or questions from the public? Roll call, Mr. Secretary.
Ms. Anderson?
Yes.
Ms. Bourdain?
Yes.
Mr. Delapietro?
Yes.
Mr. Harris?
Yes.
Mr. Molnar,
Yes.
Mr. Sedana?
Yes.
Mr. Tamburello?
Yes.
Mr. Velez?
Yes.
Mr. Treebwasser?
Yes. Ms. Murphy, do you have any recommendations at this time?
No, Mr. President, I do not.
Is there any old business that should be brought before the attention of the board?
Mr. President,
Mr. Molnar.
through the chair, could we get an update on the progress over at School 18?
Absolutely. Mr. Wolferman, if you please.
Yes, thank you. Externally on the building, we are working on flashing and stucco around the top to the sides of the building to prevent water from infiltrating the building in the addition part of the building, which is the back or lower half of the building. There are also weep holes that are put in, so in case any water did happen to seep through, there would be an exit for it so that water would be kept away from the inner part of the building. That is going on now. They are finishing up in the courtyards as well as the sides of the building. They will be finishing up the back of the building after that. Internally, we've removed the old spline ceiling in rooms 7, 9, 15, and the hallway that runs from the nurse's room and the stairs next to that all the way to the front vestibule, and also a little side of the hallway that runs to the external door by the parking lot area. This was done by a remediation company in an overabundance of caution, which included testing for anything. All came back clean. They are in the process currently of putting in the new ceilings in all those spaces. They've also secured loose tiles or anything that looked like it might potentially fall throughout the part of the building with the spline ceiling. And they've also removed the floor in room 30. They've abated that, and that new floor will be going down early next week.
Thank you, Mr. Wolferman. Are there any other old business to come before the board? Is there any new business to come before the board?
Mr. Treebwasser, just would like to address
Mr.
one
Harris.
issue, not an issue. It was a new policy put on the books under the policy and planning agenda. It was regarding the traumatic event team. This was in response to this past spring. We revised our policies, our procedures concerning a traumatic event. Two recognized employees with an expertise in this particular area took this on, working with Ms. Bear and her team, and I just want to give her a shout out for taking that on and getting it done before ahead of the new school year. So I want to thank you for getting that completed. Thank you.
One thing, Mr. Secretary, will you please make a note that on item 19, I have to abstain on the name Valerie Henderson?
On
Personnel agenda, yes.
So noted.
Thank you. Sorry. Is there any other new business?
Mr. President?
Yes, Mr. Molnar.
I just want to mention our custodial staff, our teaching staff. You know, we have a couple schools. Summertime's hard enough to take a school that was used for so many months and then a short period of time to clean it and then get it back to order. But, you know, for the custodial staffs at, 18, the custodial staff that'll be coming into 29, Woodbridge Middle School, even 11 with the construction going on across, just a note just to our staff there, thank you so much for your patience. Construction's never easy. Anybody that has done construction on their house and trying to live in it, it's, you got to have a lot of patience. But I think if we look to the end product, what we're going to have, I think it'll all be well worth it. I mean, we're going to have our bumps in the road. We'd be foolish to think we're not going to have them. But, we'll try to minimize them as best we can. And like I said, they're doing a great job. I was actually over at Woodbridge Middle School today, and, the custodians are there trying to clean certain areas, and there's construction going on. And, so I just want to thank our staff for their patience and their energy and everything. And, I think in the long run, a couple years from now, we'll see the fruits of all this, and I think it'll be worth it for the school district. So keep up the good work.
Thank you, Mr. Molnar. Is there any other new business? In keeping with our past practice, we will open this portion of the meeting for statements from the public. If you wish to say something, please come to the microphone. Provide your name and address for the record. Please limit your comments to no more than 5 minutes in accordance with Regulation 1100D.
David Pinkowitz, Island. Before I get to my previously referenced topic, just to clarify the privacy interest in the drug policy that you just adopted. We weren't talking about saying the names of the students. We know that the policy requires that they be kept confidential. This is about your bodily privacy. It's a privacy right that most people have. It's the same reason why this board can't adopt a policy to test every student and why they could only pick the students that, quote, voluntarily participate in activities or get a parking pass for athletics. That's what I'm talking about. So the comparison, it's not the precisely the same privacy right I was referencing about the board protecting itself, but I think it's even a more fundamental one, the right to be free of intrusion in your own body. And the board obviously didn't seem to think much of that. But anyway, getting on to what I wanted to talk about for now, as I referenced earlier, the board had adopted a doctrine of necessity, a resolution for invoking the doctrine of necessity. The particular doctrine of necessity at interest here was for the June 29th meeting of last year. And what happened was, the topic was about the superintendent. Any board member that has a relative that works either directly or indirectly for the superintendent of schools has a conflict, and normally, under normal circumstances, would be unable to vote. Similar to the way, we had one board member declare a conflict on the personnel agenda with the name of the person they conflicted with. They couldn't vote on that item, but the rest of the board could, no big deal. But in this case, 5 members of the board couldn't vote. Some years and some events, it might be personnel, like in this case, or superintendent. In other cases, it might be, we've had times in the past where it was with the township or other issues. But in this particular agenda, so they listed, the board did as it usually did, it listed Frank Delapitro's wife as a secretary, who's indirectly supervised by the superintendent of schools. Daniel Harris's mother as a secretary is indirectly supervised by the superintendent of schools. listed Brian Molnar's cousin is a teacher, Jonathan Treewasser's wife, niece, and nephew are teachers, Eileen Zullo's daughter and niece are teachers. And again, all indirectly supervised by the superintendent of schools. The School Ethics Commission came back and said, no, we want you to list the actual name of the conflict, which they hadn't previously stated in their recommendation for how to invoke the doctrine of necessity. Now, I should note that in June, probably in response to this very action, they have released new guidance to say they want the names, although this board, I believe, is not subject to that due to the settlement agreement that was discussed at the last meeting, because it says they don't have to do it for the future, although I think the board should. The reason for this doctrine is because we know there's a conflict, right? Normally, we just prevent people from having, whether they would vote because they're biased or whether we just want to avoid the appearance of impropriety, we don't let them vote. But in this case, the board can't act without a majority of its members. So we have to let them vote. That's what the doctrine of necessity is. But what the law requires or what school ethics require is we want them to say who the conflict is with so that it's public, everyone can see it, and we're aware of who the conflicts are with. And that helps avoid the situation where if there were improper benefits conferred on those employees, let's say by the superintendent of schools, maybe through hiring or advancing in their career, but also if the board member would vote in favor of something they shouldn't vote in favor of simply because of bias, it at least tells us that the biases are there. Now, what happened in this, what they wanted to do is list the names. And keep in mind, every board member must file personal relative statements every year. So this information I'm about to read is all public, and I'm not giving away anything that isn't available for anyone to search on the school ethics website. So what they wanted to say, instead of Frank Della Pietro's wife is a secretary, they wanted to say Frank Della Pietro's wife, Linda Della Pietro, is the secretary. Daniel Harris's mother, they would have said Daniel Harris's mother, Kathleen Harris. Brian Molnar's cousin, it would have said Brian Molnar's cousin, Janet Service. Jonathan Treewasser's wife, niece, and nephew, it would have said Linda Treewasser, Valerie Henderson, and Michael Henderson. For Eileen Zullo's daughter and niece, and Eileen Zullo is no longer on the board, obviously, it would have mentioned Pamela Kaminsky and Christina Kozak. And that's all it was asking to do. It would have been read, it would have been posted on the board on one School Street, the School Street headquarters of the board, and that's pretty much it. And that's all it would be. And the board said in their lawsuit that the members of the public could ask about it, which is why I figure I could speak about it as well here. But what also bothers me is there was a lawsuit involved that spent $20,000 in the name of the board, Frank Della Pietro, who's a board member, and Linda Della Pietro, who is not a board member. And one question I have is, did the Della Pietros contribute to the legal expenses, or did the board bear the full expense?
The Della Pietros were specifically named because we wanted to ensure that we had standing before the commissioner and to be able to put a face on what the board's concerns were. This case was about privacy, it was about security, it is about the rights of nieces and nephews. They're not elected officials. Nobody has a problem coming up here and saying that they have a conflict because they have a family member who is supervised by the superintendent. But why did that family member have to have their name called out every time a doctrine of necessity was read when they are not an elected official? That's all it was about. And there were concerns about saying over and over again that the fire commissioner's wife is employed in the district. That's all.
Well, the resolutions never said fire commissioner.
Well, I'm just saying that they were specifically named because they had a particular concern.
But I find it interesting you said the balance of their privacy rights, but you didn't mention the corresponding interests of the public. Well, we talked with the drug policy, the interest of the drugs.
And let me just say this to you, okay? The commission agreed with us because they settled. We didn't have to go to court. They settled with us and said you do not have to read out the names of your family members. It is enough to say my niece, my nephew, my wife. It's not necessary to constantly be saying their names in public when they, as I said, are not elected officials.
I mean,
I'm not going to argue with you anymore. That was the reason.
That's fine. You don't need to argue with me, but as is obvious from the commission coming up with new guidance that says, to say the names that they gave to every other district, they clearly didn't agree. They just didn't want to spend any more money on this. It's a dumb fight, but it's a fight that the board shouldn't have had. $20,000 would have more than paid for the security cameras at one of the high schools. And, and frankly, if the board didn't have standing on its own, that's a personal lawsuit for the Della Pietros or any other board member that wishes to bring it, or any other person that's not a board member to bring it. And the board isn't allowed to
Pinkowitz.
pay for the personal business of a board member.
Thank you. Your time is up.
I would just like to say how I'm glad the state watched our money, $20,000. That's like a spit in the bucket to the state. When they really want to go after EPA cases and stuff like that, they'll bleed you. But they wanted to settle. They settled because you're absolutely right, Ms. Murphy. The commission just basically took it on their own and made the rules saying that we should do this. And there was no standing to it. They didn't settle because they wanted to save money, because they'll bleed you in every other way.
Thank you, Mr. Wallman. Are there any other comments or questions?
Dan Grossberg, Island. I want to thank you again for kind of heading this off at the pass and giving an update on School 18. It is something I do want to inquire about. So you had mentioned all this work that was being done or is supposed to be done or is being done right now. Based on your guidance from the last meeting, I went to the website and looked at the website, at the many different web pages on that website, and for some sort of line item or description of the work that is to be done. The only thing that I could find on there was a PDF of proposed work, and it listed in 5 phases, and so it's been, like 9 weeks since school let out, give or take. Based on the updates that you've said and the information that was on that PDF, we're not even done with phase 1 out of 5 total phases, which include only replacing tiles and piping insulation. So this work that you said about the flashing, stucco, weep holes, etc., I feel like that's been said over and over again every time we have these meetings, that this is the work that's going to be done or this is work that's in progress. What do we have to show that work is actually being done there? And when are we anticipating it to be completed? Because we're very close to the next school year starting very soon, and we didn't even get through phase 1 of replacing tiles and insulation on pipe.
So I'm gathering your expectation is that all 5 phases were going to be done this year. That was never what we alluded to and never what we promised. This is going to get done in probably 5 phases, depending on what time frame allows us, so as not to disrupt anything when the students are going to be in the building and we don't have time to do it thoroughly and efficiently. The project on the outside, we anticipate it being completed or near completion before the beginning of school. Any work on the outside that is not completed will be able to be done between the hours of 9 and 12, and then again after the kids go back inside. The work inside with the ceilings, the floors, and the hallways will all be completed before the students go in. The air testing will be done, and the school will be put back into proper condition. As time allows and cost allows, we will address the other 5 areas, and if they can get done more quickly in a break period, and they can assure us it'll be done, then we'll take it on. But if they say to us, well, we think we'll have it done in a week, and we only have a week to do it, and I'm not taking that chance, because I don't want to go back to doing half days again at another school. So we've resecured everything, so we should not have any more issues with ceiling tiles mysteriously falling. We should not have any other issues with the rooms that we've already addressed in phase 1. That should be completed. I believe the ceilings will all be up and intact by Monday, so the janitors can finish doing the thorough cleaning of the building, and the teachers hopefully will be able to get in sometime next week so they have time to, in more hurry than we would like, but get their rooms back in order.
I'm glad you mentioned expectations. So to be clear, those 5 phases were only replacing tiles and piping insulation. So you just said that all of it will be done by next week. So I mean, that's maybe why expectations are thrown off.
The 5 phases are not all in just...
On the PDF, they are. The 5 phases on the PDF are different room clusters of replacing tiles and piping. That said, as far as expectations, the expectations were to address the problem, not necessarily...
I'm looking at it. So phase 1 has 5 subcategories in it. That is the first step that's getting done. When that is all complete, then we will start on phase 2, which will be a next group of rooms, a block of rooms, and a block of things that we can remediate completely. that by the time we're done with all the phases, it'll in essence have a new interior on the building as far as the ceiling and the old asbestos floor tiles go, and any asbestos insulation that may be in those ceilings.
Yep, I'm just going off of what I saw on the website.
That's what I'm looking at. I don't see where it says the 5 phases are done in one shot.
It doesn't say anything about timing, and I think
Okay.
that's kind of the issio. But regardless,
So what you're asking for is more clarification on the time frame.
well, yeah, and if you say it's going to be on the website, then I don't know, where on the website did you go? Is there a specific page on there? Is it not the School 18 update, which is a PDF that, again, lists out 5 phases of replacing tiles and insulation on pipes?
It's on the left-hand banner under announcements.
Yep.
District improvement, I'm sorry, Indiana Avenue School 18, 7/20/18.
Yep.
Click on that PDF. And I would also add that in addition to phase 1, not included on that is the floor in room 30 and all of the exterior work.
Right.
Which was a lot. So in addition to what is listed as phase 1, we did additional work that's not listed there.
Are
We'll
you
get
looking
it.
for a more comprehensive description of the work that's done?
Yeah, I want to understand what actually is being done, because what is being said and what you guys are telling me, I want to believe it, I really do. But I don't know if it is or not, and I don't feel like I could take your word for it, sort of thing.
Why would I lie to you?
I have no idea, but
Well, I guess.
maybe it's not a lie. Maybe it's a non-answer, or like it's an
I don't
unknown.
walk around the building because I'm trying to deceive anyone. We went there and walked around, and we'll walk around again before they're open to ensure that all the things in that phase 1 are complete prior to the opening of school.
Right. Yeah. And as far as expectations, we said we're going to address the problem, not the symptoms of the problem, which
We
is
are,
mold.
and that's why the exterior of the building, what's being done with that, instead of being, 1967 technology, some of the work that's being done behind the walls will prevent anything from penetrating the building envelope. So if water is to get behind the fascia, it will be channeled back out, so it goes back out through a weep hole.
Okay, so that is work that's being done, but
If you
like
go-
specifically, we can't.
I mean, you can physically go and walk around the building and look.
If you take your car down Elizabeth Avenue, you can see the work that's being done on the exterior.
Right, but there's nothing that lists out the work that's being done, or like the type of.
We will, once
it's done?
Once it's all completed, or most of it is completed, before school starts, we'll get a list and we'll say, all right, phase 1, number 1, check. Number
Okay.
2, completed.
Dr. Zaga, so just do me a favor, read, in phase 1, read one of the sub-things. What's,
Remove under controlled conditions the spline ceiling tile system, stabilize any uncovered pipe insulation, and fine clean the void above the tiles.
Okay.
Location, main lobby and adjacent corridor near the nurse's office. All that spline is gone. It's all been remediated. The workers are there now replacing the ceiling. Number 2, classroom number 7, entire.
So what more detail would you want on that?
Everything that you're saying about the outside of the work and the routing of the water and the weep holes and
So
stuff,
what you really want to see is the architectural plans for it.
I guess, sure. And also, to your point about the testing, all the testing for the mold and everything, that takes a while to get results back. So, like, if we haven't already begun that, I mean, are we going to be able to get it done before school starts?
It's all been done.
It's all been done already.
We wouldn't be replacing the ceiling without the test coming back clean.
So you're not going to do testing after the ceiling and everything's replaced?
The dust in the ceiling, that was the issue, that's all gone.
we couldn't even get into the building because it was sealed off while they
And it
did the remediation. Once the remediation was done, they came in, did testing. Once they found it was clean,
Yeah.
then the crews came in to start hanging the ceiling tiles.
Yeah, I just feel like when they did the remediation the first time that mold was found, that's when they found asbestos because something was disturbed and knocked in. They found a few fibers, right? So,
But the one thing that seems to fail to make it to public discussion is they didn't find airborne fibers, they found surface fibers, which is a very distinct difference. So, I mean, it's been tested. They're telling us that it is all the asbestos that was in the areas. That whole area has been wiped and remediated. Certainly, if it's safe to go in because they're done with it, I'm sure you can make arrangements to go with Mr. Wolferman and take a tour of the building.
Brian and I are there every day.
I'm sorry?
Brian and I are there every day,
Great.
checking on the work.
I was there too today.
And
I mean, I guess what it is we could keep testing that building all the time And there's always a chance that a fiber will come, and it may not even be from that building.
Right.
Because fibers of asbestos occur naturally in the environment. So, you know, we're not tearing the building down. The experts are telling us that it is clean. It was clean before the new ceiling is going up. It is being professionally cleaned, and the janitors are cleaning it after that. The schools are going to be open, and it is going to be safe for our students and our staff to go in.
Okay.
If you would like to go walk around, I'm sure we can make that arrangement for you.
Cool. And just so I completely understand, I just want to read back. You guys have already done all the testing and everything like that. You're putting up the new ceiling. Everything's great to go, and you're not going to do any more testing. We're going to be ready to go with school come a few weeks.
Correct.
September 5th.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank
Oh,
you.
and I could come arrange a visit with you guys.
Same here.
Thank you.
Being as there's no more comments, the chair will entertain a motion to adjourn. Do I have a motion?
So motion.
Motion by Mr. Tamburello. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second by Mr. Velez. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Meeting adjourned. Thank you.